Here's a line-by-line explanation of how context with timeout works in Go, along with detailed reasoning for the outputs generated by the code. 1. Basic timeout with context. Line-by-line explanation. 1. Create a context with timeout. A context.WithTimeout is initialized with a 2-second timeout. This means that after 2 seconds, the context will cancel itself and notify any dependent goroutines. Example output reasoning. The task is set to run for 3 seconds, but the timeout of 2 seconds ensures the task is interrupted. 2. Defer the cancel function. Cancel is deferred to ensure all resources tied to the context are cleaned up after the timeout. 3. Launch a goroutine. A goroutine is launched to simulate a long-running task. Inside the goroutine, a select block listens for the task completion after 3 seconds, time.after 3 time.second, a timeout signal from ctx.Done. 4. Timeout occurs. Since the task duration 3 seconds exceeds the timeout 2 seconds, the ctx.Done channel signals cancellation first. The goroutine stops and prints the message, timeout occurred, context deadline exceeded. Output explanation. Timeout occurred, context deadline exceeded. The timeout is triggered before the task completes. The ctx.error method indicates the reason, context deadline exceeded. HTTP request with timeout. Line-by-line explanation. 1. Create a context with timeout. A context.WithTimeout is created with a 1-second timeout, ensuring the HTTP request will cancel itself after this duration. 2. Attach context to request. An HTTP GET request is tied to the context using ap.newRequestWithContext. This ensures the request respects the context's timeout behavior. Execute the request. The HTTP client sends the request. 2 outcomes are possible. The server responds within 1 second, and the request completes successfully. The server takes longer than 1 second, triggering a timeout. 4. Timeout occurs. If the server doesn't respond in 1 second, the context cancels the request. The program prints an error message indicating that the request failed due to timeout. Output explanation. Request failed. Context deadline exceeded. The context cancels the request before the server responds. The error returned by the HTTP client explains the failure. Context deadline exceeded. 3. Managing goroutines with timeout. Line-by-line explanation. 1. Create a context with timeout. A context.WithTimeout is initialized with a 2-second timeout. This context will propagate the cancellation signal to all worker goroutines after 2 seconds. 2. Launch worker goroutines. 3 worker goroutines are launched, each performing tasks, e.g. printing working in a loop every 500 milliseconds. Inside each goroutine, a select block listens for a cancellation signal from ctx.Done, the ability to continue work if no signal is received. 3. Timeout occurs. After 2 seconds, the context sends a cancellation signal via ctx.Done to all workers. Each worker stops gracefully and prints a message indicating it was stopped. Output explanation. Worker 1, working. Worker 2, working. Worker 3, working. Worker 1 stopped, context deadline exceeded. Worker 2 stopped, context deadline exceeded. Worker 3 stopped, context deadline exceeded. The workers periodically print working until the timeout occurs. When the timeout is reached, all workers receive the cancellation signal and stop. The ctx.error message explains the cancellation reason. Path 4. Nested contexts with timeout. Line-by-line explanation. 1. Create a parent context. A parent context.WithTimeout is created with a 3-second timeout. This context controls the overall operation duration. 2. Create a child context. A child context is derived from the parent with a shorter 1-second timeout. The child inherits the parent's cancellation behavior, but also has its own independent timeout. 3. Task execution. Tasks tied to the child context will time out after 1 second. Tasks tied to the parent context will continue running until the parent's 3-second timeout is reached. Timeout behavior. The child context times out first and its tasks stop. The parent context continues until its timeout is reached. Output explanation. Child context canceled, context deadline exceeded. Parent context canceled, context deadline exceeded. The child context times out after 1 second, canceling its tasks. The parent context continues for the remaining 2 seconds before timing out. Key observations across all examples. Timeout propagation. When a timeout occurs, all dependent operations tied to the context are notified via ctx.Done. Resource cleanup. The defer cancel ensures that resources associated with the context are freed after the timeout. Error messages. The ctx.Error provides a consistent way to understand why a context was canceled. Context deadline exceeded. This detailed explanation